like suicidal bugs or something.
Okay. Well, just so that everybody in my house knows, we're now streaming, so if your name is Jeremiah and you're trying to dump a cup of milk on my head, Jeremiah, okay, you're getting way too close to my head with a cup of milk.
Right?
Yeah,
That's enough, Jeremiah.
Stop stream now. Hey Dad, why are you losing the picture?
So good morning, I don't know. I have started up here a minute or so before 11. Let me know, or Harold know, if you are on. Jeremiah, please don't dump a cup of milk on my head. And here we go. So, like I said, feel free to shoot either myself or Harold a text. Let us know that you're in. I have no idea where the chat feature is on this thing, so that will not necessarily avail you of a whole lot right now. Hi, Jeremiah. Always have to keep an eye on him. Okay. So good morning, everybody. Hopefully you have been able to log in without any issues. All right, well, it sounds like Harold and family at least are in. I don't know if others are in. Again, let me know if you are. That way I know that I'm not just talking to myself, although I'm pretty good at that. All right, and let's see here. We have Todd and family are in. Good to have you. Look at that. My mom said good morning to me, so either she's in or she just figured that she's going to say good morning and then she's going to do something else. What? Okay, so this does need to go out as a church-wide announcement. Harold said no coffee this AM. Now, are you asking me if I've had coffee, or are you simply saying, Harold, that you're not drinking coffee this morning? This is the type of disclosure we need as a church body. Because I've already had a pair of cups of coffee today, and I'm already rolling here. So my coffee drinking credentials are pretty well up to date. Yeah, of course you don't see me having any coffee. I already drank my coffee because I don't wait until 11 o'clock in the morning to drink my coffee. Just as simple as that. So, all right, well, I know at least that we have Harold in, Todd and Kelly family are in. My parents sound like they're in. Again, feel free to either shoot myself or Harold a text. Let us know that you're here. See, Harold, even my parents have had their coffee already because they don't wait until 11 o'clock in the morning to have their coffee either. So I think that the church has pretty well come to a consensus here. Yes, I agree. Harold does need to have some discipline if he waits until 11 to have his coffee. We'll have to discuss that, at a later date or something like that. It's 11:04 right now, and I would say that we'll get started here in a minute. I am actually going to grab a glass of water, and then we will begin here. If you know of anybody else that is having any trouble logging on or anything like that, again, feel free to shoot either myself or Harold a message. And awesome, Renee, good morning. Great to have you on here. I'm going to grab a glass of water, and then we will commence what we're going to do here, because I forgot to grab one earlier. But Harold, this is just for you. See? There we go. Yes, Jeremiah. Yes. We're going to be in John, the book of John, but we're going to be in a few different places in John's gospel, okay? So you may want to get someone to help you out.
Grace is over here.
All right. All right. Awesome. Very, very cool. So it sounds like Beth and family are on. Also, Devin has a job. That's awesome news. So on that note, I think we're going to get started here. Uh-oh, Harold's texting me again. That means I'm in trouble. Yes. So Harold just texted me. Same thing. So Trembler's on. And yes, Devin has work, which is excellent, excellent news. So what we'll do is maybe just kick off with a word of prayer, praising God for that, and then we will get started into what God's Word has to say for us as we kick off a brand new week. So let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for today, and just thank you for the beautiful day that you have given to us and the weekend that we've been able to have, Lord. In this time of year, as we watch the leaves change colors and then drop, just as we watch you unfold the seasons, Lord. We're also thankful for everyone that has been able to log on, just for continued well-being. And we're especially thankful for the great news that Devin has a job. We just pray that you would continue to bless him and bless him at that place of employment, that this would be the job that you have laid out for him. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. All right. Well, so I'm going to get started. So I'm going to take one quick last look at my phone just to make sure that there aren't messages that I have missed, but it doesn't look like it. So I will try to keep it nearby, but I'm pretty good at ignoring my phone even when I'm supposed to pay attention to it. So I can't guarantee you that I will necessarily see it if you text me from here on forward, but I will try. So getting started, kind of looking at today. One of the things I was drawn to, and part of this is just because of doing Life of Messiah with the students, John's gospel is unique to, the four Gospels. The other three, Matthew, Mark, Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, they follow a lot of very, very similar courses as far as the miracles of Jesus that they show and the travels that they take us on. They have a lot of very, very parallel sections. John's Gospel is different because there's a lot of what John includes that the others don't really include. For instance, the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 is found in all four, but other miracles that John records, for instance, like the changing of the water to wine at the wedding feast, the other Gospels don't record. So studying John's Gospel is always cool because you're going to get things that the other writers don't necessarily include. John, being the last Gospel written, didn't really need to go through and reiterate what other people had already ably said. He instead was focusing on what else the church needed to know about the life ministry of Jesus and his person that, well, maybe had been developed in the other Gospels. He wanted to make sure that there was additional highlight. And John's a great source because John is one of the closest disciples to Jesus. Oftentimes you'll see Jesus traveling with the 12 all over the place. They must have been in tremendous physical shape because they got to take a grand walking tour of the land of Israel. Back and forth here, there, everywhere. But there are other times that you're going to see, for instance, when Jesus goes to the Transfiguration, that he only takes 3 of them. And John is always going to be one of those 3. Or that, for instance, when Jesus prays in Gethsemane, 3 go further on. John is one of those. So John is going to see Jesus in instances where even necessarily some of the other 12 wouldn't necessarily. So not only is John with Jesus walking all over the Holy Land, and even parts just outside of what we would qualify as the Holy Land, but he's also with Jesus in some of those very, very vulnerable moments when everybody else, not just the crowds, but even the disciples aren't there. Basically, John's going to be with Jesus in everything except for when Jesus withdraws solitary to go pray. Other than that, it seems that John is there for everything. So this is really cool because of these closest intimate disciples, John's going to write a gospel, and he's going to point out things that the other writers don't necessarily include. Now, one of those features is how John structures his gospel. John doesn't structure his gospel chronologically per se. I'm not trying to say that he is giving us problematic chronology, but his entire focus isn't to make sure that the earliest things that happened in Jesus' life is at the very beginning and the latest things that are at the very end. If you want a chronological gospel, Luke's gospel is the gospel that you should go through because Luke is going to follow Jesus' life chronologically. John is going to orient his gospel according to teachability, so he's going to include some of the great teaching moments that Jesus includes. Many of the longest teaching moments that we kind of go to will be found in John's gospel. I mean, the only one that we really think of as an extended teaching moment that Jesus does that's not in John's gospel, rather than like Matthew, is the Sermon on the Mount. And also we get in Matthew the Olivet Discourse a little bit later on. But other than that, a lot of the famous teaching moments that we have are going to be found in John's gospel. If you think about it, his discourse with Nicodemus, for God so loved the world, the discourse with the Samaritan woman at the well, is going to be in John's gospel. If we think about I am the way, the truth, and life, actually we're going to get to that in a little bit, but that extended teaching time with the disciples is going to be in John's gospel. So there's going to be a lot of these great teaching moments in John's gospel. And to a degree, that's what we're going to hit here today. Because what we're going to go through, I'm going to give an overview, because John uses a group of 7, what we call the 7 I am statements. And that's one of the ways that he kind of weaves together his gospel into a single and significant whole. So before we get into any of the 7 particular statements, what I want to do is actually I want to go into John chapter 9. So if you can go to John chapter 9 with me, we will kind of begin to dig into some of the heart here. So John chapter 9, and I wrote down the wrong chapter when I typed this out. That is impressive. Okay. Stand by, I'm redirecting your call. Well, how did I pull this off? Because John chapter 9 does not have a verse 58, and I'm not entirely sure how I pulled off what I just did. Okay. So I am dreadfully sorry about this because evidently I have written down one of my references wrong, which is not going to do anybody any good. Okay, Well, it's John chapter 8, so I guess we'll recover that way. So in John chapter 8, in verse 58, Jesus is going to be summing up a wonderful conversation that he's having with some of the Jewish religious leaders. And in John 8:58, he's going to say, "Most assuredly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." And he's going to, if you look at it in your Bible, the I and the am should be in capitalization. This is, of course, referencing back to when God spoke to Moses and said, basically, I am that I am. This is a clear claim at divinity. And if you look at it in verse 59, the people that are listening to Jesus know exactly what he's saying. They're not confused. One of the things that people will look at the New Testament and they'll look at Jesus and they'll say, well, Jesus never claimed to be God. And oftentimes people come to that conclusion because what they're looking for is they're looking for Jesus to say something the way that we would say it today. But Jesus doesn't live today in the sense of conducting his earthly ministry. He lived in first century Israel. And in first century Israel, he's talking to a Jewish audience. And for them, what he says right here is very, very crystal clear to how they understand the Old Testament. They know exactly what Jesus is claiming because they're getting ready to throw stones at him, but he's going to be able to escape from them. That is, they're ready to conduct the punishment for blasphemy. Jesus just claimed equality with God, and that wasn't missed on his listeners. And those two words, I am, are going to be words that Jesus is actually going to use with a fair degree of frequency. Like I said, there's going to be 7 I am metaphors that Jesus is going to use that John's going to record for us, and he's going to use that in a way to help develop his theme of talking about who Jesus is that we might believe, because that's really John's major emphasis. If you go all the way to the end of John's gospel, he says these things were written that you might believe, and in believing you may have eternal life. So when we encounter these, we should take very careful notice. Now, this is just going to be an overview today. We're going to start in John chapter 6, because what I want to do is I want to at least briefly introduce each I am statement, give a little bit of the idea of what the context that Jesus is talking in, and then a little bit of what Jesus is saying. Each one of these would have to be studied individually, but there's no way that we would fit that into just one Sunday morning. So what we want to do is we want to at least get a feel for what these are, and also hopefully, rather than just only focus on one today, but also kind of get a very broad idea of what Jesus is saying about himself. Because if the point of the Gospels is to reveal who Jesus is, and Jesus is here, as he says, to reveal the Father, then we want to have a clear idea of who Jesus is then describing himself as being, because that's really gets to the heart of this. Who is Jesus? Who is he, revealed to be? And John is going to give us a great resource here. So in John 6:35, now these I'm pretty confident of. Hopefully I didn't write any of these down incorrectly. John 6:35, though, says this. Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. Now, we've all encountered this verse before, and a lot of us probably even have a pretty good general idea of what Jesus is saying. One of the things, though, that I want to make sure that we really think about before we kind of just pass over this, though, is the context that Jesus is saying this in. Now, in order to get that, what we have to kind of get an idea is not just where, what the next chapter says, what the previous chapter says, but also try to get an idea of the timing. So I can tell you the context, but it's a lot more fun if we go and we take a look at it. If you go to the beginning of John chapter 6, it says in verse 1, after these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and then a great multitude followed him because they saw his signs, which he performed on those who were diseased. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now, this is a fairly common theme. As Jesus is performing miracles, a crowd gets attracted. Very often we'll see Jesus withdraw with his disciples. The big thing is that people are going to follow him. So up until this point, they had been over on maybe the more settled area along the shore of the Sea of Galilee. he is withdrawn to someplace a little bit more remote. So Jesus lifted up his eyes in verse 5 and sees a great multitude coming toward him. He said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" Now, keep in mind where they are. There's not like, the local Freihofer's distribution center that they can go hit up and be able to purchase this. A lot of times we talk about how much money this would require, which is what Philip hits. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient. Cost is one thing, but the other thing is actually then being able to acquire the sheer volume that you would need to be able to have. I mean, if you update and you look at that, a denarii be about a laborer's wage, so let's call it $150. So if you multiply $150 times $200 and you want to go drop that amount of money on bread, I realize that, over the last month or so, it's getting a lot easier to drop that amount of money on bread as everything becomes more and more expensive. But that's a huge volume. You might have to hit up a few grocery stores. Well, I don't know if there's, like a Hannaford sitting around in the Galilean countryside that you're going to be able to hit up. So we know that what's going to happen here is Jesus is going to be able to miraculously provide food for this entire crowd here, which it's numbered at 5,000. It's 5,000 men. You're probably looking at a much, much larger group of people. After this happens, Jesus is going to send the disciples, he'll withdraw to pray, and then Jesus is going to come and he's going to walk on the water. Now, here's why I'm keeping on going through this. Verse 22 is really, really important because it says a little bit about our timing. It says, on the following day, when the people who were standing on the other side of the sea saw that there was no boat there except the one in which the disciples had entered, and that Jesus had not entered the boat with his disciples, but his disciples had gone away alone. However, the other boats came from Tiberias near the place where they ate the bread after the Lord had given thanks. When the people therefore saw that Jesus was not there, nor his disciples, they also got into boats and came to Capernaum, seeking Jesus. And when they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, "Rabbi, when did you come here?" So the same people that were there for the miraculous feeding, once they realized that Jesus was no longer there, that the disciples weren't there, but they knew the disciples had gotten in a boat and Jesus hadn't, they basically went on an all-out Jesus manhunt. And they went to the principal town that would have been along that area of the Sea of Galilee, Capernaum. So they go there, they encounter Jesus, and they start looking for him. And they find him. Now, why do you think they want to find Jesus? I mean, think about it. What had Jesus just done? And Jesus discerns their motivation. In verse 26, most assuredly I say to you, you seek me not because you saw the signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled. So when Jesus is giving his first I am statement, I am the bread of life, it's coming in the context of the feeding of the 5,000. And the mindset of the people that are approaching Jesus are primarily approaching this physically speaking. And remember, this is the feeding of the 5,000 is one of those things that all four gospel writers are going to record. And if we look at all four of them, we're going to get a much clearer picture. This is only that overview. But we need to understand that Jesus is giving us this statement in the context of feeding the 5,000 and the crowd then reacting to this by basically coming up and saying, hey, that was great. Why don't we do this again? He says, I give you a bread that never hunger. They're like, even better. And their minds are in a completely different place than where Jesus would have them to be. So in verse 35, when he says, I am the bread of life, he who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst, he's seeking to have them change their mental plane from the physical to the spiritual. Because no matter how great of a meal you ever eat, its satisfaction is only ever going to be temporary. I mean, you're going to have to eat again. It's one of those pesky things. Ask anyone that is responsible for making dinner in the evening, and one of the great sources of frustration is how much work can go into making a great meal and how fast it can go. And then the very fact that unless you have great amounts of leftovers, you're going to get to do something relatively similar the next day. Now, this does not mean that making meals is a futile enterprise. Please don't get me wrong. Meals are awesome. But they're not meant to provide what is permanent. And while the crowds may have been allured by what Jesus offered that wasn't permanent, the actual physical bread, he's basically telling them, I have something much, much more important that lasts much, much longer than mere physical sustenance. But you're going to have to change your mentality. You can't receive what Jesus has if all we're interested in is the temporary and the stuff that scratches the immediate itch and doesn't necessarily answer some of the eternal problems. So automatically we see right here with Jesus' first I am statement that he is trying to change how people are even dealing with their own expectations, change how people are approaching what they're looking for from him. And, I know we never ever deal with this in life, where sometimes what we would like from God is for God to solve our circumstances or to take care of the things that are maybe first and foremost on our minds, and maybe we forget that God has an eternal perspective and has a much, much larger plan than maybe our immediate circumstances. If we move to the next one relatively short, in John chapter 8, verse 12, now this is where Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And this is one of the, kind of the most famous ones. It's interesting because it gets dropped into a passage where, the woman is brought to Jesus and no one casts any stones. He's going to make this statement. And, then the Pharisees are going to continue kind of an examination of Jesus. The broader context of this is Jesus is in Jerusalem. He's actually, probably pretty close to the temple complex. But at this time period, he's actually in Jerusalem to celebrate a feast called the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, this is there to commemorate Israel as they were moved by God's leadership through the desert from Egypt and eventually, obviously, reaching the land of Canaan, what we know as today Israel. So one of the major aspects of celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles is they would set up a huge, basically a huge candle in the temple compound, oftentimes in the court of the women, and it would be a massive candle. I mean, the idea here is that this was supposed to shed enough light to basically expel all the darkness from, that basic area. They would set up a number of maybe smaller ones to give light, but they would set up one large candle, again, a menorah candle, a candelabra, that would illuminate the entire court. They would illuminate the entire complex. The histories of the time period talk about that when this was lit in the temple, that it would give you the entire temple complex would glow because of how reflective the gold and the various other parts of the temple were. But that when this was lit, it illuminated the entire mount area. You could see it from all over Jerusalem. So when Jesus is saying, I am the light of the world, he actually is, he has, for lack of a better term, he has a physical representative, bit that would be burning all day, all night, that would obviously would especially be very visible all night on the Temple Mount. So when he's saying, I'm the light of the world, people got the idea of just how bright this light was and how well illuminated it was and how easy it was to spot. But what's significant is that this was set up in the temple during Tabernacles as a specific commemoration to remember when God led Israel by fire by night and cloud by day through the wilderness wanderings. So it's not just that it was this bright illumination that made an easy object lesson. When Jesus says, I am the light of the world, they go, oh yeah, like the great big light that's in the temple. We get it, a bright light. But it's also what that light represented, because obviously Israel understood that was the Shekinah glory that led Israel through the desert wanderings. God was there leading them every single step of the way. So as Jesus is referencing this exact commemoration in the temple, he's also drawing a very careful line between himself as the light that is there to guide God's people through the darkness that exists, through the darkness of sin, through the darkness of all of maybe even of this time period, maybe the traditions that had begun to creep in, that had begun to cloud people's view about what exactly God was doing. So as Jesus demonstrates and states, I'm the light of the world, not only do they have a physical object to be able to kind of grasp to help them understand this, there is the symbolic significance of what that light in the temple is there to represent, so that while he doesn't necessarily say before Abraham was I am and make the same exact claim to deity than maybe that we see very, very clear later on in John chapter 8, eventually that it's significant that claim does come later on in John chapter 8 when Jesus claims to be the light of the world, because they understood that the light that led them through the desert wanderings was God himself. And this is going to start an extended questioning period between Jesus and the Pharisees. So if we keep on going, in John chapter 10, we're going to encounter two I am statements that Jesus is going to give us. The very first one in John chapter 10, Jesus is going to first say in verse 7. He's also going to repeat it in verse 9. Then Jesus said to them again, most assuredly I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. Now, oftentimes we would state this, I am the door of the sheepfold. So, since none of us probably have been actively constructing ancient Israeli sheepfolds, we may not be super aware of this, but you wouldn't house your sheep in a barn the way that we think of it. Jesus wasn't born like a nice red barn with a hayloft. That's just not how they did things. So they would have an enclosure. It would be a stone-walled enclosure that they would guide the sheep in during the night to keep them safe. And what would happen is, obviously, you need to have a doorway, right? You can't make this a solid ring of stones. You have to be able to get in and out somehow. So anytime you put a hole in anything, and you can ask this even as in a contractor, right? As soon as you put a penetration in a house for windows or anything else, you create an automatic vulnerability. The best way to take care of that vulnerability is to take special care that while it is now vulnerable, that you can do something to counteract how vulnerable that is. Your ring of stones has a natural vulnerability. You need a door, you need a passageway so you can get the sheep in and out, you in and out. Otherwise, it doesn't really do you any good if you have a great big stone ring with no way to get in or out. That's not going to help your sheep at all. So you have to be able to pass through. So what happened is the shepherd would sleep in the doorway. Literally basically saying, if you want to get to my sheep, you have to go through me. And that's what Jesus is basically saying here. I'm the door of the sheep. The sheep, i.e. being the ones that the Father had given to Jesus, that Jesus says, I will not lose any of them. Jesus says, I'm the door of the sheep. If you want to get to those that the Father has given to me, then you're going to have to go through me. So if you think you can beat Jesus, then you have access to his sheep. Now, this is kind of an ongoing debate here between Jesus and the religious leadership of the day, because Jesus is basically going to say, you guys are inadequate at taking care of God's sheep. You're not really doing this right. And this is actually highlighted by the previous chapter. The previous chapter in John chapter 9 is an extended miracle. Is an extended discourse of Jesus healing the man born blind. Now, Jesus healing the man born blind was a huge deal for the leadership here, because they didn't have a good explanation for how Jesus healed the man born blind. The theology of the day said that he would be born blind probably based on his parents' sin or his own sin. His disciples, Jesus' own disciples, actually ask him that question in verse 2 of John chapter 9. So Jesus said it's not because of any person's sin that he's born blind. He's born this way so that God's power can be shown in him, and he's going to cure him of his blindness. And everybody knows he was born blind. So now the question is, how is the rabbinic Judaism of the day going to deal with that? Now, to make a long story short, the Jewish leadership is going to call this person in, They're going to question him. They're going to basically ask, how were you made to see? And he's basically going to say, well, not necessarily in so many words, but if I summarize it for you, Jesus did it, and they're not going to like that answer. And they're going to call this guy's parents in, and his parents are going to give the Jewish leadership the great line, he's old enough, ask him. His parents basically tell their son, you're on your own, you deal with answering the Jewish leadership. The Jewish leadership, basically because they can't get the person to say something ill about Jesus, basically he's going to say that he thinks that Jesus is the Son of God, and they're going to excommunicate the person that had just been healed from Jewish life. They're going to excommunicate him from the synagogue. They're going to basically remove him from Jewish life. Jesus is going to go to him, and as you read this toward the end of John chapter 9, he's going to ask, basically, do you know who I am? In verse 38, the person's going to say, Lord, I believe, and he worshipped him. And at the very end of this, in verse 40, some of the Pharisees are going to overhear Jesus' interaction with this guy, and they're going to say, are we blind also? And Jesus is going to say, if you were blind, you would have no sin, but now you say, we see, therefore your sin remains. In other words, they had this idea that they were all set, that they didn't maybe have the same needs that maybe some of the other population did. And they say, well, how in the world does this necessarily connect to them being, Jesus saying that he is the door of the sheep? Well, think about it. The Jewish leadership just excommunicated somebody because they didn't like how he answered a question about how he had been healed and who Jesus was. Their response, rather than to actually investigate really with an open mind who Jesus is and consider the person of Jesus, rather than do that, their actual responsibility to lead Israel to accept the Messiah is actually leading Israel 100% the other direction. And anyone who indicates that they may be accepting that Jesus is the Messiah, they're going to remove from social and spiritual life. So they're not even remaining neutral. They're actually actively working against what Jesus is doing and who Jesus is revealing himself to be. So, again, they're not providing the adequate protection for the sheep. It's not very far over. Actually, all I have to do is I flip one page. If I go to verse 11, we get to the next one, which is, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. And obviously we know that there's no better picture of this than the crucifixion of Jesus. So the context here is the same context coming on the heels of healing the man born blind. And he demonstrates that far from using the people to aggrandize themselves and grow their position like the Jewish leadership was, Jesus came not so that he could be served by the people or recognized and applauded by the people, but so that actually he could give his life for those that he was sent to save. In other words, Jesus is the type of leader, the type of shepherd that is actually supposed to be the case. He's demonstrating proper leadership, and throughout this is going to be contrasted with the ineffective and, in fact, the counterproductive leadership that had been given to the Jewish people by the leaders of the day. So you have this antagonism going back and forth between the leadership of the day and Jesus. And Jesus, by talking about himself as the good shepherd, that while shepherds weren't necessarily considered as reputable at this time period as they were maybe back in the time period of King David's reign, God as the shepherd of his people Israel is going to be a fairly consistent Old Testament theme going through, and indeed it's going to be kind of the backdrop, symbolically for how we think of maybe the most famous chapter in the Bible, the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. So if you think about this stream here, the question is, who is providing the protection, the care, who's willing to give his life for his people? Really, is it the Jewish leadership of the day, or is it Jesus Christ? Well, if we look at the example of this person born blind, we've seen that rather than the religious leadership being willing to give of themselves to guide, that they really are actually interested in the exact opposite, and that Jesus is really the only one that fulfills the true shepherd mission that God has for someone to be a leader. That he's the one that's willing to give of himself in miracles and in serving the people, and ultimately we know on the cross itself. So it's not too far away, again, throughout John's gospel. Again, he's going to be framing his gospel around these I am statements. And you notice that these statements frequently are following tremendous miracles. So, for instance, we see I am the bread of life coming after feeding of the 5,000. We see I am the light of the world, not as a miracle so much, but Jesus reads the mind of those that are ready to cast stones at the woman who has been caught in adultery. We see these two right here. I am the door of the sheep and I am the good shepherd, coming on the heels of Jesus healing the man born blind. The next one is in John chapter 11. It's found in verse 25. Jesus is going to be speaking to Martha, and he's going to say, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? Now, Martha has a sister named Mary. Mary is the one that's more devoted to listening to Jesus. Martha is the one that wants to make sure that everything is perfect and everything is all, decorated nicely and all the provisions are taken care of, which is great. But Jesus says, Martha, you're worried about these things, but there's something that's more important right now. But in the context of what we're talking about right here, the most important feature is that Mary and Martha have a brother, and their brother's name is Lazarus. There's only one great big problem with Lazarus at this time. He's dead. But we know that Lazarus doesn't stay dead. Now, it's not because he's only mostly dead. Okay? Wesley's not going to come help or anything like that. He is indeed deceased. And he's been dead for 4 days, which, then would be meaningful to the rabbinic traditions of the time period. They would have said that the soul had left, that he was truly dead. There would be no possibility of any quote-unquote funny business. Everyone would have accepted what is going on here. And of course we know that Jesus is going to raise Lazarus from the dead. So he says those immortal words, I am the resurrection and the life. Jesus is going to clearly demonstrate his power over death. Now think about it. Who has the power over death? Who would the Jewish people understand would have the power over death? God. God alone. And it's actually going to be, if we keep on reading, we're going to see that this is going to be so problematic for the Jewish leadership. They're going to conspire. They don't actually just want to kill Jesus. They actually are conspiring. They would like to kill Lazarus as well. Because having a person wander around who was dead and has been raised to life again is rather problematic for them. So, hi Jeremiah. So this is going to be one of their, you could say, additional projects. Now, the last two come in the frame of Jesus teaching his disciples at the Last Supper. So the next one is John 14:6. This is one that, all of us would probably have it memorized. If you don't, I would strongly encourage you to, because coming on the heels of I am the resurrection and the life, Jesus now is at the Last Supper. He is going to be on a cross the next day. So this is kind of his last teaching time that he's going to have with his disciples. So he's going to give us two in this context. So the context is the upper room. They're celebrating Passover together. We understand this now as communion, as Jesus is going to go and he's going to celebrate the cup. He's going to offer the bread. He's talking about going and basically not being with them for very much longer. He begins chapter 14, let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. I go to prepare a place for you. The disciples go, whoa. Like, where are you going and what's going on here? Because this wasn't fitting their mental paradigm. And Thomas is going to ask him in verse 5, Lord, we don't know where you're going, and how can we know the way? Jesus is going to say the immortal words, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except through me. And what a great statement, what a powerful statement. Jesus is declaring himself as the only way to the Father, the only way to heaven, the only way to God. This is an incredibly exclusive claim, which Jesus' disciples would have been entirely comfortable with, considering they're coming out of, they are monotheist, so in a Jewish, context, an exclusive claim would not have made them uncomfortable. But this is still something that it's going to take them a while to kind of get their minds fully around here, as they believe who Jesus is, but they don't necessarily understand all of the different aspects of the plan. For instance, you're going to see, if you keep on reading through these passages, they don't fully understand why Jesus has to die. They don't necessarily understand the resurrection. They're still coming to grips with that. And it's easy for us to look back and say, how could they miss it? But remember, they couldn't read about it as having already happened. They have to, as I put it, live it forward. They have to understand these things as they're living their day in, day out lives, as they've been taught by Jesus. So for them, this is still information. These are concepts that they're still grappling to understand. But really, they have the same choice that everybody does, and that is we all need to come to grips with answering the question, who do we really believe Jesus is? Is he really the only way to heaven? Is he really the only way to God? And it's not just us, it's actually all of humanity. So it's great that they're sitting here and they're kind of processing this, and we see Jesus explaining this to them, because Jesus is telling them basically, I'm only going to be here for a little while longer. I'm not going to be walking with you on earth in the way that I have been forever. Eventually I will go away. I'm going to heaven, but I will come back for you. But in that meantime, then understand that they will have to keep on going. And that naturally brings us to the very last I am statement that John is going to give us, and that's found in John 15, where Jesus is going to say, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, that it may bear more fruit. Because this is the natural question. Well, if Jesus is here leading his disciples, then it makes pretty good sense how they're going to be able to continue moving forward. Who's going to teach them? How are they going to learn? How will they be able to progress? But if Jesus leaves, how is that going to happen? Now, we understand that Jesus is going to talk to them about sending the Holy Spirit. But the other part that we need to understand, when Jesus says, I am the true vine, he's still in that same basic discourse with his disciples. But for them, it's how are they going to have the strength to continue moving forward? And the answer here is actually, again, the vine metaphor had been used by God in relation to Israel in the Old Testament, so this wouldn't have been completely unfamiliar. But how is it going to address them specifically? Well, if you are a branch, then the only way you're going to derive any strength and sustenance is from the vine itself. And Jesus says, I'm not leaving you completely without resources. I will continue to be your vine. I'm going to continue to be the source of your strength, your sustenance. I'm going to give you what you need in order to accomplish the task that I've given to you, i.e., what you need in order to bear fruit. Because he's leaving and he's the only way, he's not only the only way to God, he's the only way we're going to have the strength and the sustenance that we will need to be able to accomplish those things that he's given us in life to be able to do. Those are the 7 I am statements of John's Gospel. And as I sat here and I looked at all of them, one of the things that I was struck with is just how many of them are concerned with how Jesus sustains those that believe in him. I am the vine. I mean, that's very, very, that's entirely tied to sustenance, sustaining life, because a branch has no life apart from being plugged into a vine. I am the bread of life. I mean, for them, bread was the staple. So again, we understand, the crowd certainly understood bread as a physical sustenance. Jesus is talking about it in a spiritual sense. So we see that sustaining part. Both of the metaphors related to sheep and shepherding, I am the door and I am the good shepherd, talk about care, protection, provision. I mean, one of the basic jobs of the shepherd wasn't just to protect the sheep, but was to provide for them. Sheep, are well documented as not being very bright, but it's not the job of the sheep to take notes on where the good watering holes are, where you can get grass at various times of the day, Where are the valleys? Sheep don't take geography lessons. Sheep don't have any of those, cares or concerns. It's the shepherd's job. It's the shepherd's job to make sure that the sheep are in the place that they need to be with the materials that they need to have to be able to sustain and move them forward. So one of the things I was struck by, just by looking at all 7 of them kind of in one swoop, was just how many of these are really devoted towards helping us understand just how much God cares for us, provides for us, how much He watches over us, how well He knows what we need, how He knows how fragile we are, in our various things. I mean, even thinking of I am the resurrection and the life, that our physical life ends, and this is a huge deal for those that are mourning Lazarus passing. How He knows those things, and how He is the one that is going to help us overcome those, that He can overcome the power of death, and that in the in the sum total of it, if being, having that eternal relationship with the Father, if that's our goal, and we're believers in Jesus Christ, that's what we're looking for, that He's the only one that can bring us all the way home, to be, united for eternity with the Heavenly Father. So just looking at that care and provision, the reason even I ended up looking at some of these is I was looking in John chapter 14, Jesus twice uses the phrase, "Let not your heart be troubled." He uses it at the very beginning of the chapter, and He uses it towards the end of the chapter as well in John chapter 14. And right now, there's a lot of, people that are looking at things, and there's a lot of trouble, you could say, that people see it on the horizon. People are disturbed and alarmed by a lot of the things that are happening. And maybe people are disturbed and alarmed by different things that they're seeing. Sometimes maybe, the same things. Maybe you're looking at how am I going to be able to pay bills with, the rising cost of inflation, or maybe you're, concerned about different things on the international scene, or is leadership going to be able to adequately address these challenges? And I think it's helpful to keep these in mind, that these aren't new concerns. At least one of Jesus's I am statements is directly kind of contrasted with the inadequate leadership of the context and the time period that Jesus spoke. But that we can go back to these, and we don't need to let our hearts be troubled, because Jesus is the I am. He is the only one that can bring us to the Father. He is the one that can provide the protection and the care and the provision that we need. He's the one that provides for all of the needs that we have. He knows our physical needs, but He also knows the underlying spiritual needs. He is the one that can help us move through each step of life, and we don't need to become flustered and disturbed and all thrown out of whack by all of the things that we're encountering in life, because we can see here in the resurrection of Lazarus that He's the resurrection and the life. He can overcome the largest obstacles that reign in human existence, and He can overcome them by using His words. He is the one that's going to lay down His life for the sheep. He's going to be the one that's going to create the pathway because of His substitutionary death, paying for our sin. It overcomes the darkness of sin in our lives. And it's only because of His power and His strength that enables us to do this, that He's the I am that we follow. He is the only one that can give us that opportunity. That's what we as believers in Jesus Christ have. We have it sitting here as we go through John's Gospel. I hope that we have this kind of written in our hearts, and that it's what we fall back on. And it's what people desperately need to be able to continue to move forward day in, day out. We as people aren't designed to carry all of these cares and concerns and worries in our day in, day out lives, if for no other reason that I can't control all of those variables. I can't, quote unquote, make everything okay. It wouldn't do me any good to assure my wife and my kids that everything's going to be okay, in the sense if I only had my own resources to rely on. I can't change anything. None of these large macro things that people get all concerned about. I can't make the trains run on time. I can't make boats get unloaded. I can't do anything about energy prices. But I can go to the one who promises to take care because he is the great I am, that I don't know how all of those things will work out, but I do know I'm under his protection and I'm under his care. And I know that if he can defeat death and he can pave the way between God and man through his death on the cross, then I know I can trust him. And that means that I don't have to worry about all things. It doesn't mean that I'm not aware of those things. It doesn't mean that I don't derive my strength to continue moving forward day in, day out from the vine that is Jesus Christ so that I can act when he would have me to act. It means that I don't have to take on that some responsibility to solve it all and have all the answers and know everything and be able to assure everybody that I've got a plan and follow me. My purpose isn't to have the plan and say, follow me. My job is to say, Jesus has the plan. Jesus fulfilled the plan. Follow him. And that's what I kind of want to even offer us here today, is that's ultimately what we do. We follow the I am of Jesus Christ because he's the one that has the answers to really whatever is hitting our radar here. He's the one that can provide. So I hope this was an encouragement to everybody here this morning. It was an encouragement to me even as I looked at them. They're challenging statements because very often, rather than looking at Jesus and saying, he is the I am, I have the temptation to run into problems and say, in relation to the answer, I would like to be. We would like to be our own answer sometimes because it makes us maybe feel more in control. But the reality is that I don't need to be the one that's in control. It is sufficient for me to recognize that he is the one that's in control, because that's ultimately the only way that I'm going to be able to move through the challenging situations of life.